Good afternoon, everyone. Hello and welcome to the first webinar in the LACE Summer Series. The first webinar is called The Causes of Buyer's Remorse for HR Technology. I'm Chris Horton. I'm the Go-to-Market Director for LACE Partners, and I will be your host today. A really big welcome to you all, and thanks for joining us. I've had the pleasure of working at LACE for over 2 years after a career both as a consultant and as a client side running large HR programs. I've worked at Vodafone, Accenture BP, and a number of other companies, and I'm joined by 3 great panelists today. First of all, I'd like to welcome Aaron Alburey. Hi, Aaron. How are you doing?
Hi, Chris. Great to see you today.
Aaron, can you go ahead and do a quick introduction?
Of course, yeah. No, I was reflecting before today's call. My career started quite some time ago, back in the PeopleSoft days. And even back then, we had quite a lot of buyer's remorse going on as the systems quickly changed. So really excited to share that experience. I'm the managing director and co-founder here at LACE Partners. I'm very excited to spend some time chatting through one of my favorite topics.
Great, Aaron. Thank you. Next up, a big hello to Marcus Beaver. Hey, Marcus, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Welcome from York. I was smiling at the PeopleSoft comment there because I was in Oracle when we acquired PeopleSoft, and we were wondering, was that going to be buyer's remorse? But it was quite interesting to see the competition who were now colleagues. So I'm the leader for Alight in the UK and Ireland. Like Aaron, we spent 25, 30 years in this sector already, worked with Oracle, with KPMG and with Accenture, and now with Alight, and we're a global HR transformation and technology consultancy, about 15,000 people, 200 countries, multiple languages. So hopefully we'll bring lots of our client experience to this call.
Great, thank you, Marcus. And certainly, last but not least, Tim Ringo, welcome. How are you doing?
Thanks, Chris. I'm just fine. Just a little bit about me. So I've had a 30-year career working across Accenture, IBM, and SAP SuccessFactors, leading human capital consulting practices in those companies. And more recently, I've been an author and a conference speaker and an executive director at LACE. My most recent book is called Solving the Productivity Puzzle, and I'll bring a little bit of that sort of productivity angle to the discussion today. Looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind people that you can ask questions throughout the session. If you go to the Q&A button and type in your question, we will try and make sure that we incorporate those questions throughout, or there'll be a section at the end where we can do that. Okay, great. Let's get started on our questions for today. We're going to cover off 5 different questions. I would like to start with Aaron first off, to really look at question 1 around what do you think are the primary reasons for buyer's remorse when you're buying HR technology?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. It's a great question to start with. And I think before we get into the reasons for buyer's remorse, maybe I think we should talk about the reasons why people typically buy HR technology, because the two are intrinsically linked. You might be buying it because you want to improve experience and people's experience of HR services, or just their interactions with the business, data and insights, trying to answer specific business questions. You may be doing it simply to simplify the environment and drive cost savings, or in a lot of cases around compliance and controls, where you may need to put a new system in, whether it's a payroll system, for example. So there's lots of different reasons for doing it. And I think really understanding those reasons and getting to the heart of what you need to achieve as an outcome is the core of why people undertake this. And it's also the reason why a lot of the time I think you see buyer's remorse, because during the process of the program, those two things, the purpose of the program and the purpose of why you started it, can diverge. And I think we often hear people talk about, the system's not working, it's not delivering, it's not giving us good return on investment. And there are lots of different reasons that can underlie that. Some can be the system, right? You could have purchased a system that no longer meets the needs of your business. You may have grown, you may have done acquisitions, may have done divestments. You may not have the full use of what you wanted out of it, or you may not have had enough budget to really get it to where you wanted to. But the other things that contribute quite often into buyer's remorse, I think sometimes are things like, not sufficient change management to get the adoption that you need, or to manage the expectations well enough as you go through the process. Lack of sponsorship and leadership. Quite often we see buyer's remorse occurring 2-3 years down the line. The original sponsors have moved on, new sponsors have moved in, things have changed in the business, so the reasons for doing it and the reasons that were originally sound and made everyone focus on it may well have changed. Some of the other things that can get in the way quite often with HR technology now in the cloud, you're buying into a service, you're buying into a continually improving system. So you need an ability to take advantage of that as those new functionality elements get released. If you don't have the capability as a business to continuously improve, to take those changes, to put the policy changes in and launch it into your business, you can feel frustrated that you have bought something you're not getting full value from. So there's lots of different reasons and lots of different factors, and I think really trying to get underneath the skin of why you were doing it from the start helps you understand why that buyer's remorse may be occurring.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. Some really good points around, making sure that you're getting the budget right, making sure that as things change around sponsorship and leadership throughout, and different things around support. Marcus, would be really interesting to hear your viewpoint on what do you think the primary reasons for buyer's remorse are?
Yeah, I think listening to kind of what Aaron said there, I think if I maybe go more down the actual technology aspect of it then, so in terms of the kind of clients I've worked with, sometimes they go out to market predetermining the decision. There's a kind of an unconscious bias of perhaps, who sponsored the latest conference and who they've had the most engagement with. And I kind of joked before, sometimes I'll do the Coke test and get 3 of the leading platforms and get a screenshot and put a different logo underneath each. And it's interesting how people will select the system based on the logo. So, the advice I kind of give to clients is don't do the same as you've done before. Just because that technology platform worked in that sector doesn't automatically mean it'll work elsewhere. So I think kind of going into it, with a very open mind. I think also that's the same in terms of the partners as well. Depending on the organization you've perhaps been in before to the one that you're in now, you may need a different partner. Some organizations, they need a certain size and shape of partner or partners. And I think it's about getting that right blend for the organization that you're in. So that's kind of the before piece. I think the during the program, clients I see will either buy too much, they buy everything, and then it can be quite overwhelming. And then there's the pressure on the business case then to deploy all of that and get it all in as fast as possible. So I think it's about kind of right sizing for the business case, what's needed. You can always get a price hold for everything else later. And then the converse is sometimes true, where people are maybe too conservative and they think, I'll just break it off a bit at a time, and actually aren't brave enough to get the footprint they need. And then there's maybe then not enough time or budget later on to go and maybe replace the recruitment or the learning system. So final comment would be afterwards, is sometimes clients join an organization, as you were saying, Aaron, post-decision stakeholders have moved on. My advice there would be make a decision really early on what you've inherited, what's good, what's bad, indifferent. Because if you don't make that decision soon and make the changes, you inherit it and then it's yours.
I'm loving the Coke test, Marcus. I think that's definitely a great takeaway from this. I think it's also interesting, the scale of do people have the ability, or do they buy everything that they need? And also interesting around what they've inherited and making sure that they understand where they're at. Okay, just a reminder to everyone, can you paste or put your questions into the Q&A? Fantastic. Okay, let's jump to our second question. And Marcus, as as you're already speaking, let's continue with you. Question 2 is a bit of a three-parter, and really looking at it at a couple of levels. Marcus, do you think companies need to move their HR systems to the cloud as the first part? Second part's around really looking at the debate about best of breed versus an integrated suite. And the third one is, if you don't move to the cloud and you stay on premise, are you really going to suffer from buyer's remorse?
There's a few angles to that. Obviously, if I work for a software vendor, of course, I'd be telling you to move to the cloud. However, in the world of kind of consulting, I would say there's a couple of angles to that. A couple of years ago, some clients were either, I've got to get to the cloud. Sometimes that just means hosted. So it was there was a lot of kind of pushback as well. Without a doubt, there's very few organizations I've met in the last 5 or 10 years when I've been working in cloud that couldn't get there. So I don't think now it's a, do I stay on prem or cloud? It's a, when can I get there, and and how fast? What clients are looking for sometimes is that extra lever to get to cloud. And ironically, everybody was concerned about security in the cloud. It's the on-prem platforms that are being hacked. So, there are clever hackers in certain parts of the world that in the last, 6-12 months, it's been on Sky News with various payroll platforms, HR platforms, or pieces of software that are intermediary platforms between HR and payroll. So, it doesn't take much of a Google to find out, what's happened there. And it's always been the on-prem version. And the challenge with on-prem versions, like if you take the one recently, which was the intermediary software, organizations had more than one instance of that software. So it gets very, very complicated. So, touch wood, in the last 5 or 10 years that I've worked with my clients with cloud platforms, none of them have been hacked. Now, sometimes people do silly things with access to data, but the systems are solid. In terms of the best of breed versus suite, whether you're on-prem or cloud, I always start with the premise of get as much as you can from a single vendor and de-risk it. And sometimes, the bright and shiny add-on, unless it's truly a differentiator, it's sometimes worth getting the 7 or 8 out of 10 as part of your suite rather than getting the 9 or 10 out of the best of breed. So I would just kind of say start there. And sometimes clients kind of forget, actually, they already have some best of breed solutions, and, keep them where they are. You don't always have to rip everything out. So I think that's kind of what I'm seeing at the moment in terms of, move to cloud and best of breed versus suite.
So some great points there around, I think everyone is pretty focusing around getting to the cloud, and the question's more around when can you get there and how fast can you do it. I think interesting debate around security and on-premise and what's needed there, and some interesting comments about single vendor. So thank you very much, Marcus. Tim, I'd love to jump to you. Same questions as a three-parter. What's your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anymore there's a kind of, if you're going to move to the cloud, it is when, as Marcus said. And one of the reasons for that is that SAP is going to sunset SAP HR in the next few years. They sort of shift the date back a little bit here and there, but it is going to be before 2030. Oracle will do similar with PeopleSoft. Quite a few other popular on-premise are not going to be supported in the near future. So people are going to have to move onto the cloud, and it just makes financial sense, and it ultimately makes good sense from the organization's perspective, because those old systems, those legacy systems, were built around compliance and process. They weren't about making people better or more productive. These next generation, both cloud systems and then more experience type platforms, as we're kind of moving into the next generation, are all about more about making people more productive, making their jobs easier, right? That's the idea. It's not about compliance and process so much anymore. So that's another reason that I think people move to the cloud, or should be moving to the cloud. I think it's really interesting what's going on. A lot of people have been in the cloud now for a while, either whether that's Workday or SuccessFactors or whatever, and a lot of people are starting to now add on best of breed to those implementations, which I think is really interesting. I think it was inevitable because some of the best of breed that are coming along are, for instance, in applicant tracking or recruitment or even succession planning are better than what you can get in these platforms like Workday and Oracle and SuccessFactors. So, it's making sense for people to bolt on things like Degreed or other sort of, best practice platforms. And I think that's going to be a continuing trend. So again, it's almost not a question. It's kind of, well, when and what are you going to do in terms of best of breed versus your integrated end-to-end platform. And yeah, I mean, I think that the whole idea of staying on premise, it's definitely going to create some buyer's remorse because it's so expensive and not very flexible and usable in terms of an organization's platform. So, but that's sort of my point of view on it. That's kind of the view that I take.
And Tim, I think it makes absolute sense as the different players sunset their on-premise systems. Obviously, people will need to move across. I think some interesting comments about best of breed, particularly around ATS and learning there. Okay, let's jump to question 3. And Tim, I would really love to continue with you. Return on investment and the sort of key to why we think companies aren't achieving the return on investment they expect from their agents.
Yeah, there's sort of 2 types of business cases that I see. There's what I call the break-even business case, means your implementation of whatever platform you're going to put in place is going to save you enough money to offset the cost. And that's not very exciting, nor do I think that is really a true return on investment. I think the best kinds of business cases are those that are focused on the cost savings and then the uplift in productivity, right? And you don't see those so often. And I think this is why people start to question the value. It's like, well, okay, we saved some money, but big deal. Really, these platforms are designed to increase people's performance, increase business performance. And quite often, business cases don't include that, or even worse, they're not measuring that after implementation. So I think quite often they don't get a return on investment because you've either decided to focus on the wrong things to measure, or you haven't measured things that give you bigger sort of value, as in performance and productivity. And therefore, it looks like what you've implemented doesn't have a good return on investment. And I think more rarely there's situations where people just never set out a business case, never look to measure any of these things anyway. I think that's pretty rare, but it does happen. But those would be kind of the 3 instances where I think return on investment can fall down. And it isn't a matter of it not being there. I think mostly it's about not defining it and then not going and measuring it and trying to go for the big ticket items that bring you a lot of uplift. So for instance, if you were to create a Salesforce, put a Salesforce onto these types of platforms, where they're going to get new learning, new performance objectives, all these sorts of things, you can manage better. If you can just get 5% increase in their productivity, well, that's worth a lot of money, right? So it's those types of things you want to use to ultimately, I believe, measure return on investment. And don't forget about the cost savings. It's important, but the upside is much bigger on the performance side.
And Tim, you've talked about measuring the right thing. You've just mentioned sort of some of the financial metrics that you need to look at, whether that's cost efficiency, etc. What are the other kind of things that you would try and call out around productivity and performance?
Yeah, it really depends on the organization. I mean, I've seen a lot of organizations typically include in their business case, for instance, time to competency of new hires, right? That's a pretty standard thing. But if you can somehow, by having an integrated talent system, integrated performance support system, you can get new hires up to speed quicker, and there's a real value in doing that, right? So that's a performance type of metric. There's other similar kind of metrics that you can use around performance. I gave a sales example there. You might want to look at how IT projects are now better run because you can get the right people in the right place at the right time, and that can create value as well on the performance side. Which these things, and McKinsey's and others say they're worth something like 5 to 10 times more than just saving costs on on IT costs because you've moved to the cloud, right? So it's really about those sorts of things to be looking at. But yeah, it really depends on the organization, but there's all sorts of things. You can get really granular, you can get really quite specific, and there's almost no argument between finance and HR that there's value if there's an uplift in performance in that sort of metric. So that makes it a lot easier to show the value.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Aaron, do you want to chip in and add your point of view?
Yeah, no, I will. And I think we had a question as well, Chris, come through around sort of previous buyer's remorse when people have bought systems before. And I think it's kind of all wraps into these answers. So I'll try and address some of that as we go as well. But I often think that return on investment is all about value, and value very much like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? And so understanding who your stakeholders are and what they really value from this is critical. And quite often, I think we get lost in the transformation itself and lose sight of what we're trying to do it for. And the objective becomes completion of a date, not necessarily actually achieving the outcomes for different stakeholders. And there are different outcomes. If you're a manager, you want a less complicated life that makes data easier for you to access. If you're a leader of the business, you want insights that help you make critical decisions. If you're a head of talent, to Tim's points, you probably want, time to productivity, time to competence is one of your major metrics. And if you're in the HR ops team, you probably just want a simpler process that makes your life easier and not keep you going around in circles. Those things can be at odds with each other, and you need to find a balance. But you need to make sure you look at all of them to make sure you get to that return on investment. And I think quite often, one of the biggest challenges around people feel they don't get that return on investment is because they haven't done that work to really understand the stakeholders. I think some of the other things that contribute to this as well is, as I say, you quite often focus on getting to the go live and forget, as Marcus and Tim have mentioned, those costs that happen after go live, support costs, ongoing transformation, the ability to have a capability to do continuous improvement and release new functionality. These are hidden costs in those models and those business cases. You need to look for those, get those out on the table and be clear with them. And as long as you're doing the program for something that is really valued by somebody, then those costs, as Tim mentioned, quite often they're a break-even case these days, but those costs make sense to people because they can see the reason why. We do a lot of payroll work, right, along the way, as well as HR work. The two are intrinsically linked, but with payroll, quite often the case is very compelling around compliance and controls, right? And it's quite binary. You've either achieved that or you haven't. With HR, it's a little bit more complicated. There are different reasons for doing it, different achievements. And I really like the point that Marcus made earlier, around differentiation as it being a critical part of this. When you're doing things like the why a best of breed versus a core cloud system, we've got to be really clear on who values what and why you're trying to differentiate. And if you can address those things, then it stays in people's minds. That value stays in their minds. The reason why you're doing the program and the time it takes to do it, the cost to do it. All makes sense in the round, and then you keep the return on investment and you manage expectations. I think where you've got previous goes at putting a system in and that hasn't gone well, and therefore there's buyer's remorse because of what that is, I think you've got to understand, again, the same reasons, right? Why has that happened? Is it because your business has changed fundamentally from when you did it before? Was it that you didn't have the budget you wanted before and you made a compromised decision, and therefore you bought maybe a system that wasn't quite what you wanted? Have the stakeholders changed? A lot of the things we've talked about will be the reasons why, but really understanding those lessons learned, if you can, inside the business, as to why it failed before, will help give you the keys to how to unlock the return on investment moving forward. And just because it's gone wrong before for the organization doesn't mean it's still not the right thing to do. Just means that there's more lessons learned to take on board to help you adjust your plans as you put it into play.
So thanks, Aaron. I think a number of really helpful points there about not getting lost in the transformation, focusing too much on the data and technical implementation rather than focusing on what the stakeholders and value needs to be doing, and looking at the different insights across the the patch and also around support costs. Marcus, I'm interested in your viewpoint and adding to Aaron and Tim's point of view.
So I was going to cover the implementation and AMS piece, and I was looking at the kind of questions coming in, and there's clearly a theme on ROI before we even talked about ROI. So I was thinking I might, Aaron, if you're okay, I might just kind of rattle through some of the answers to some of those questions specifically, and link that back to where we're at in terms of kind of ROI. So switch from Workday to success factors. You should be able to get Workday to work. If you run success factors, that should work as well, unless it's been fundamentally implemented wrong to start with. I had an ex-client phone me up and said, I'm live on Oracle. I can't get all this stuff to work. And they'd gone position rather than job. They needed job to get the functionality and the processes they needed. So I would just say, get a partner to come in, not the vendor, properly look at it and say, can that be fixed? Or actually, is it a rip and replace? And actually, it may be I've done it where we've had to rip out what was there and put back in the same vendor. Rarely is it the software. In terms of kind of negotiation, obviously quarter ends and half year ends and ends of financial year are always a good time to negotiate with any vendor. You'll get an idea by talking to other clients of both the vendor and the partner what they've paid before. And also maybe what they forgot to pay for, they didn't budget for. So that normally gives you an idea as to, is your budget right? But I think, again, software is one bit, what it costs to put in. I think that's where you've got to get around this, around this side of the table and work with your partners and say, let's go through this together and build the solution together rather than ask for something and then negotiate. In terms of kind of the ROI around employee engagement, I see too much focus on that controversially, and people concentrating on, does it look right? Is it a consumer grade interface, etc. Actually, the key thing there is to get the change management correct, the training correct, all the assets that you need to make it land in the business, and measure it, and sometimes look at it and go, actually, we're not quite getting this right, and maybe there's a cultural difference, or you've acquired a business and they don't want to feel dictated to. So I would say, if you can measure it, then you can then manage it and adjust the approach. Smaller organizations, I think you've got to, on your ROI there, got to look for what's the business case for this for the business, not for HR. You'll probably get a stronger business case if you can align it with growth, divestments, acquisitions, rather than we can improve process and reduce headcount. And particularly if you're a smaller organization that's got payrolls elsewhere, they're always a good place to go and hunt for a business case that you can properly put numbers against, particularly if you've got small numbers of people in lots of places. I saw there was a question as well around, the investment up front versus, the post go live. Absolute classic that, I'd even start with it's a 50-50, and people forget the second 50. So there's always a focus on what's it cost me to buy it, what does it cost me to go live, and they completely miss the fact that actually it's the next 5-10 years, and what does a cloud operating model look like to keep transforming the business, not just go live and leave it as it is for 12 months. In terms of change management required, absolutely, particularly with cloud. This is not about customization or configuration either. It's more about change management is that area that gets chopped. And the other two areas that need to be focused on is data migration and integration. They're the two big numbers, and if you concentrate on getting those two right, everything else will probably land in the right budget envelope. Demos, again, right? Software vendors are great at doing demos. Partners like ourselves are very good at helping you see the tells, and also make sure that we can say, well, when we've helped a client go live with this functionality, this process, this is how we use standard, and this is how we had workarounds, and just help you with the gotchas, I think. That's just a few with some of the questions that came up on my screen.
And I think, Marcus, the biggest thing that I take from that is, in response to the question, is rarely is it the software that's the problem. It's often, how it's been implemented and the different decisions that have been made. Having been there and done that, I also appreciate that data and integration are absolutely fundamental, and if you get that right, and also the whole change of adoption side. Can I remind everyone, really appreciate all of the questions that are coming through so far. We would actively encourage you to keep on asking questions, and we will happily answer them as we go. Okay, moving on to the next question. Marcus, I'm going to bring you in again. How do companies avoid common mistakes in their HR technology investments?
Major mistakes. I'm again looking at the questions here. There was a question around, examples of, that's kind of successful key factors. I think, it's making sure that that transformation and technology program is aligned to the business, that the program understands what else is happening in the business. Maybe like I said earlier, acquiring a business, selling a business, and then looking at what are the wider, what's the calendar for the business, for HR, and aligning all of that together. Sometimes these programs can be just, they get a bit insular. So I think having that wider perspective is great. Having the stakeholder buy-in across, HR, payroll, finance, IT, anybody else is going to be affected in a positive way by the delivery of the program, and getting the governance in. It's just not enough just to kind of meet weekly. There needs to be proper governance, and a structure that both parties kind of agree to, but then to revise that governance as the program continues through. Sometimes it needs ramping down, sometimes it needs ramping back up again. And if you get people talking and building relationships with each other, nothing gets hidden, it's all out on the table, and you're all, aiming for success together. So that, the trust develops, the relationships develop. And sometimes you have to say, either on your side or the partner side or the vendor side, sometimes there just is a clash, there's a personality difference, and just saying, actually, do we need to change the mapping or indeed change the individuals? I think the other aspect to that, I would say as well, is that sometimes, there's kind of two sides of the fence. There's the transformation side and there's the BAU side. And sometimes I think people from BAU are pushed too far into transformation and they're still trying to do the day job, or they're more of a run and maintain person as opposed to be completely, transformational in their thinking. So again, that's the other thing I'd say, is make sure you've got the right blend of team as you progress through the program.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marcus. Lots of interesting things around, looking at the calendar for HR, really, not just being insular and focusing outwards, governance and revisiting that governance throughout the process, and really understanding that, fundamentally delivering HR technology, as with all big programs, is about relationships and how they're working. And at different points throughout, those relationships can be broken or can come across hiccups and need to be revisited and looked at in different ways. Mr. Alburey, can I get you to go next, please?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you, Chris. There's so much we've covered already, and I think we could take a number of these points and spend an hour on each of those in turn as well. I think there's a couple of things, and I'll try again, a bit like Marcus, to answer some of the questions that are rolling in, because they're coming in thick and fast. So thank you for that. I think for me, one of the ones that we just started to touch on there a little bit, we've all talked about sort of setting expectations, managing value, getting ahead of the outcomes that people want. And part of that is being able to therefore produce insight out of your system. And if you can't do that, there will be remorse, and there will be a feeling that you've put a lot of effort and money and you still can't answer the questions that you fundamentally want to do. And I think a couple of things that come into that to think about. One is, integrations. How deep do you go? How much do you integrate? When's it sensible to leave it as manual because it's not worth the cost of replacing it, but also where does it make most sense because it brings a level of integrity to the data and allows you to have better access to insights. And assigned to that also is one of the things that we often see is, people lift and shifting poor process or poor data into a new system and expecting a different answer out. No matter what the new system is, it's still going to struggle if the data in is still poor. So you've got to do a number of things. You've got to get on top of that data. You've got to cleanse it, but you've also got to change the process, the mindset in your organization to allow that data to be continually improved. The new systems should help you do that, but you still need to change ways of working. You need to change process, and quite often that is missed. And that can then lead to poor data still continuing to go into your new system. And as one of my clients once referred to it, I've just bought a Ferrari and I continue to put diesel in it. It's one of those things where you've just got to make sure you've got the right data flowing in, and you take the time to put that effort in, and then that will help address that feeling of remorse as you go through. One of the questions that came up was an interesting one as well around remorse during the procurement process. How do I stop feeling that maybe I didn't negotiate hard enough, I didn't get the best deal for my organization? And I think there's a number of ways to do that. I think there are definitely forums that you can talk to other buyers who've been through a similar process and compare and contrast and get a sense from them. There are people like ourselves who do independent consulting who can give you a view. We do this all the time, right? As does Marcus's organization, right? We can get a sense of what else you see in the market and therefore what is good practice and how to share that. And I think don't be afraid to ask hard questions during procurement and challenge and draw your lines where you can't give and really push those. Otherwise, as you go through, those things continue to sort of linger, and you always feel that even though it's doing the right things for you, you may not have got the best deal. That can be quite a way to remorse, I think, as you go through. There was another question that came on a little bit later as well around how do I ensure that my system meets the requirements, and make sure that system actually does what I thought it was going to do. I think, unfortunately, there's no shortcut to that. You need to do more detailed demoing. You need to do more detailed scenario testing. I think the core of that is really understanding which scenarios really make a difference to your organization, which are the critical key requirements. It's easy to run out of time. It's easy to miss the critical things if you're focusing on a really long list of requirements. If you take a little bit more time to filter, really test it with the business around what is most valued, then getting into those requirements and testing those really specifically in detail with more time and more scenario based will help you narrow that gap of risk that you carry, that the system doesn't quite do what you thought it was going to do. And always ask the vendors, always ask them to demo it, always ask them to show you a specific example, whether it's how to deal with the data influx post-merger, how to deal with a specific payroll challenge or integration. You're spending a lot of money on a system potentially, and therefore you want to get what you really think is valuable and it delivers what you need.
I was just going to say on that, obviously, vendors, they know their software and they know what it can and can't do. Obviously, their aim is to show you what it can do, not what it can't. But they don't know your business. And I think I would always recommend that you get the individual who's going to be working with you to deploy that solution, who's going to be with you for the next 2 to 3 years, to be demoing the solution to you, because they're the one that's going to configure it for you and tell you whether they can or can't do it. So there's different levels. And then obviously then if the partner that's deploying it is then the partner that supports it, the last thing they will want is you to be an unhappy customer when you go live. So it becomes self-serving in that you reach agreement on the post go live side, and then when it goes live, they're there supporting you.
And I think the fundamental that I'm hearing and that I've seen myself is it's really taking the time up front to make sure that you're going through, detailing those critical scenarios, detailing what needs to be demoed, taking the time. I like your suggestion, Marcus, around, the person implementing, the organization implementing, should get involved in the demoing as well.
I think on that, Chris, if again, it's the 80-20 rule, is focus 80% of your time on the 20% of those processes that are really gnarly, really difficult, specific to your business, about how your business operates or is struggling to operate, as opposed to spending, 80% of the time saying, show me a self-service transaction, show me I can access a payslip online. All the systems will give you all of that. It's just, focusing 80% of your time on the 20% that's really, really important, particularly if there's a financial benefit to it. And I know there's a question about business case versus value. Sometimes it will be that it's to make sure the business case is met. But actually, sometimes it's about how is this going to truly add value to the business? So strategic workforce planning, for example, that's what the operational people will be interested in. And that's where you start to talk more about value than business case.
I would just want to add one other thing, having worked on the vendor side. One of the things I see quite often is the people that are selling you the HR software don't know the HR job, don't know the HR function. And what I always try to advise people is, ask, try to understand it. And if they don't understand it, find somebody in the organization that you're looking at and demand that it's somebody that understands the job of HR. Quite often the pre-sales people are former consultants. And they can know a lot more about your job and what you're trying to do than the main account executive who really doesn't know anything about the HR job. So don't be shy about expressing your view that you want to be dealing with somebody who knows the HR job. I think that's really important.
And actually, Tim, there's probably I think a useful build there as well, because I think also clients will, and this may sound self-serving, so it's definitely not, but I think clients also think if they get the deployment from the vendor, that will make them more successful. But to your point, Tim, quite often then, those aren't necessarily people who know HR or know payroll. They just know the software really well because they work for the vendor. And what I see with some clients that we get involved with, either to kind of rescue or recover or take it to the phase X, is that it's been technically deployed by the vendor, not transformationally deployed. So again, I would just say, sometimes the vendor's better off. Your skin in the game is the customer success manager in cloud. That's how you keep, the vendor engaged and contributing to your success, not by necessarily having them deploy the software. If it's a brand new module, really dripping wet functionality, I think even the partner would tell you to get the vendor into your team to deploy it. But if it's standard stuff that's been out in the market a couple of years, then, I would go to a partner.
So jumping to our final question, and then we'll make sure that we cover off the rest of the questions. So please keep those questions coming in. We're loving them all so far, and we're more than happy to answer all of them. We've touched on a couple of answers already to this question, but I think it's a really good way to succinctly pull together. So we're potentially at a stage where things have gone wrong, or we're not getting the investment that we're expecting. Pieces of advice from each of you, or things that you would recommend to do around getting back on track and really starting to achieve some of those objectives and benefits, making sure that the ROI is improved. Aaron, would love to start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I think we've touched on quite a lot of these, so I think Marcus was summing up there some great elements around, when you come, quite often, both our organizations end up going in to help clients who have got buyer's remorse, feel their programs are off track, feel that their systems are not delivering, and putting them back on track. So we often see that flip side. And I think there's a couple of things to understand. I think assuming that the value case is still the same is probably one thing to avoid. Challenge that, go back, test. Stakeholders can change, companies change. We talked about it. So I think there's a number of reasons why the value case and why people want this to work may well have changed. It may well be, in the current market, much more of a business case cost-saving requirement than was originally there when it was first set up, or it could be flipped and be the reverse because the business is changing direction. So there's lots of different reasons. But revisiting that and understanding is a key element. The point on data, I think, is critical. 9 times out of 10, the challenge with buyer's remorse and why systems have gone off track and implementations is still that underlying data issue. And getting under the rationale why, the root cause of that, and getting to that is really critical, I think, in helping establish what to do in that space. And I think the other thing would be that, I don't know, Marcus, you may have a perspective on this as well, but quite often the ongoing support model is insufficient for the burden that is on the business in terms of either functional releases, ongoing transformational change, integrations into legacy systems or other company systems. Those things are actually still pretty intensive, even if you have moved to the cloud, and quite often are underestimated. And we often will go in and see that element is underplayed, and therefore the system is not being maintained in the way it should do, and you're not getting the real benefit from it.
Aaron, there's a couple of questions on that actually related to that. There's a question around recommending how you budget, and allocate resources effectively. I think one of the asks that any client should make of their partner is, tell me what resources I need, when I need them, and how much I need them for, because actually the partner can always resource up and run faster. So it's not just saying, the partner needs to say, well, this is what we are going to do. They should be able to help you understand what you'll need to do as well. So I think that then kind of helps with the budgeting, because sometimes clients will say, I can do more, so therefore you spend less externally. Other times clients will say, I can't do that much, or I can't do that much that fast or in that time scale because there's business pressures or HR calendars. So I think that's kind of how you can get it together. There's a comment around system admin on that as well, which links into how you support it post go live. If you've gone live and then you're training system admin, you're at least 3 to 6 months too late. So the people who are involved in a cloud solution in your business, who are going to help you keep transforming the business, keep using those 2 to 3 releases from the vendor to help you keep transforming and leveraging their latest innovation, or adopting perhaps functionality you didn't have the budget or the time to do earlier. The individuals who are doing that should be involved 3 to 6 months before go live on the program, and then it just carries on through. There's not a baton change on go live. It happens much earlier.
There's always a change deficit, isn't there, Marcus, when you go live? That there's stuff that you had to compromise, things that you couldn't do. There's then fix on fails that come through. So that period post go live is typically quite intense for whoever that support team is. So the sooner you can train them, the sooner you can get them running up to speed alongside the program, the better, and they can start to plan for that, so that there isn't that pressure point immediately post go live.
Absolutely.
And then Tim, interested in, so we've covered off, revisiting the value case, looking at the fundamental reasons. We've touched on data, we've touched on support, we've touched on budgets, we've touched on, asking good questions of the vendors around what kind of resourcing needs to happen, asking the realistic questions around whether a client actually has the resource to do certain things, or that they need to supplement, in other ways. What additional points do you think are important?
I think one of the very common situations that I see that people are in is that quite often it's IT running the project for implementing, and HR is very often sort of trying to run to catch up. And what happens in that situation is you'll very often get the old HR operating model frozen in place in the new system, which is not helpful to anybody. These types of platforms that you're implementing today, which are more sophisticated, require change in the HR operating model. And if it's IT running with it, they're not going to be interested in that. They're going to want to get it in as quickly as possible with the least amount of work possible. In fact, there was one question that mentioned, getting training done, during the implementation rather than afterwards. Well, very often the reason why it ends up being afterwards is because the IT people or procurement people, set it up that way. And again, that's where the project's running away from HR and their capability to implement. So I think it's really important to, try to get to sort of halt that train that's left the station, and try to get on it and drive the configuration and how it's going to be set up, or otherwise you end up with a situation where the system is designed or is implemented for an old HR operating model versus a new one. And that's really, I think, one of the biggest things that drives down the return on investment on these platforms, and the frustration in that we put something in and nobody uses it. And that usually is typically because it's not tied to an operating model that's going to be useful for anybody. So I think that's one of the things that I would say would help HR get back on track, which is to get on top of that program and be part of it rather than running to catch up.
So some great points about the HR operating model, but also HR's position and really driving the project and making sure that IT is not taking it in a direction that's not particularly helpful. So thank you for answering all the questions so far. We've had lots of different questions come in and really appreciate that. We've had questions from Victoria, Fionn, Andrew, Scott, Sean, Helen, and a number of anonymous attendees. And we've answered a number of them so far. What I'd like us to do now is to go through the different questions that are still open. The first one is about requirements. I think we've touched on this. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. Are there any specific considerations for global organizations with diverse workforces when implementing HR technology? Aaron, I'll go to you first on this one.
Thank you. That's a lovely question. The simple answer to which is yes, there are. And certainly you need to consider, local data requirements and data legislation is pretty much the critical one to consider. I think also, though, understanding some of the cultural challenges potentially around accessing of systems, cultural challenges around mobile technology usage. There's a whole raft of different things that I think if you're running it from a central point when you're building the value case, you can make as assumptions and you need to test. It's not the same for every organization. It's certainly not the same in every country either. So I think there's some elements there of just testing your assumptions and making sure that you're not assuming a usage that is not held or not shown across the rest of your business anyway. So doing some of that testing is one. I think also in some organizations, we see microcultures by geography, so that there are in some cultures, some businesses more collaborative in some countries and more hierarchical command and control in others. And again, just understanding your business and how it might vary by country is critical to helping you get that return on investment.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. I'm going to go to Marcus for the next one around implementation partner selection. System vendor versus
might throw that one at me. I mean, that's a very interesting question, actually, and I read it a few times. Clearly, the answer is it depends. What I've guided clients towards there is understanding politically. Sometimes, if you've an incumbent strategic partner, then sometimes that is the partner you have to work with because the business will tell you that. Sometimes the answer is to use that in-house bigger strategic partner with a smaller organization who brings perhaps more specialism and sometimes also more of an on-site presence. It depends what your appetite is for risk, outsourcing, offshoring, and what you can actually offshore as well, and the scope. So there's definitely a few dimensions to that. There's definitely no right or wrong answer. However, I think what there's also is with clients is the opportunity to get what they probably think are competitive partners to work together, because most of us know each other, have worked for one or more of them, and more now I see actually partners working together to deliver for the client rather than being kept separate and not allowed to speak to each other. So that's probably the other end of the answer to that question.
I'd agree, Marcus. I think we see multi-vendor environments quite frequently in the market, and I think for good reason, because if you understand the challenge problems you're trying to solve, to Marcus' point, you bring the best from those different together. But I think you have to do it in a partnerial way and make sure that your governance is open to allowing them to work well together. It's very easy to end up in an adversarial type scope arguing role if you haven't had that time to actually think it through and set it up for success. But I think to Marcus's point, I think if you do, it can work really well for you.
Okay. There's a couple around ethical considerations and what the organization, do organizations need to be mindful of when implementing HR technology, particularly in relation to employee data privacy and decision-making based on algorithms. Tim, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think, these newer platforms are really sophisticated now. They've had machine learning for quite some time. They're now, bringing aspects of artificial intelligence, and these things have biases in them. And I think it's really important from an ethical standpoint to understand that. And sometimes we think because it's the machine, it doesn't have biases. Well, they're built by humans, and they bring those things in. We have to be very, very careful about how some of these tools are used. However, I think they can be very, very powerful. And there was some questions earlier about what sort of new technology is coming on that's going to sort of help with return on investment. It is going to be things that have artificial intelligence in it, that help you write performance objectives, who help you write job roles or descriptions, or if you're trying to hire somebody, it's going to do these things for you. And that's great, but let's just be, the humans need to make sure that we're using judgment and making sure that the things that the AI is doing is correct and is also ethical. I think that's really, really important. But a lot of these systems are also going to have, more and more data about people. You're starting to see some of the systems have information on people's wellness, and that could be mental health or physical health. And I think we have to be really careful about how that data is handled. Be sure that the organization and people have bought in to using that data. So I think that would be another consideration as well.
I'm looking up at the questions on a screen. I'm not looking at someone else over here. So apologies that I'm probably looking away. Appreciate that we only have a few more minutes to go. So I'm going to take the remainder of the questions. We will collectively answer those and make sure that we share those answers. A big thank you to everyone. Lots of great questions that have been shared with everyone. First of all, to my fellow panelists, I want to give everyone a very big thank you. Thank you, Marcus, Aaron, and Tim. A big shout out to the rest of the LACE team who have helped to promote, develop, and deliver this webinar. A big thank you from the bottom of my heart. This is the first of a 4-part summer series, ending with an in-person event. Just a quick heads up around the next webinar. So webinar 2 really focuses on people and HR tech. So we're looking at employees, line managers, and leadership, and we're asking the question, why is the HR tech not being used? We'll have a range of people who are experts in the change and adoption space, or who have lived through the process and really want to share what they're doing. I'm going to jump to the next slide. You can register for the next webinar using the QR code. I'm going to slow down at this section because I always appreciate that with QR codes, you're probably getting out your phone, you're probably opening it, you're probably looking. So please register either to the next webinar, which is webinar 2 around people and adoption, or you can actually register for the whole webinar series, which is the QR code on the right. If you want to find any more information about LACE Partners, you can go to our website, lacepartners.co.uk. There will be an on-demand version of the webinar that will be available tomorrow. Again, a really big thank you from me for being a fantastic audience, for adding and asking lots and lots of good questions. Big thank you to the panelists, and stay cool, stay hydrated in the warm weather, and enjoy the rest of your day. Really looking forward to meeting you and seeing you again soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Chris.
Bye, everyone.